Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I lived in Statesboro, Georgia, down outside of Savannah for about 8 years, so it's nice to be back in the state of Georgia. We're praying for you that God would relieve your drought conditions and other things, so you are on our hearts and minds. Thank you for your kind remarks, Thomas. That was one of the finest introductions I've ever had. I know that the work of classical Christian education indeed give you a little bit of encouragement in your work as Christian parents, as Christian educators, board members, headmasters, and please know that I agree wholeheartedly with R.L. Dabney. There is nothing more important than the Christian training of our children, of strong arrows and quivers full of them. So be encouraged. There are two challenges, I believe, facing classical Christian schools today. One is the challenge that comes from the success of the movement. Classical Christian schools are opening all over the country, which is a good thing. But the movement as a whole has to take great care that it defines itself carefully and accurately. There are classical schools which might best be described as great book schools. There are classical schools which offer nothing more than a back-to-basics sort of education looking no further back than the 1950s. There are many other models in between. So the first great challenge facing your school, my school, classical Christian schools, is to define what we mean by classical Christian education, to define what it is we want our schools to be. The second challenge, I believe, facing classical Christian schools is the challenge of communicating that vision to the parents, to the larger community, in addition to striving to solidify parental commitment to that vision. I always tell our teachers back at Rockbridge, we have to pound the drum, and we have to pound the drum again, and we have to pound the drum again, and just when we think they might start getting it, we drum some more. So a school may have the clearest definition of classical and Christian education. It may work out the intricacies of the Trivium in its daily instruction to great effect. It may train its teachers in these things very well. But still, some parents, some grandparents, some students, maybe even some teachers may still not get it. Some people may come to our schools because they see that the children are safe, and that's a good thing. Some people, they see that the teaching is really good, and these children are receiving an unarguably good education, and that's a good reason to come. They may see all these things, but not understand that the reason these things are taking place is because theology is simply coming out the teacher's fingertips. And the school's understanding of classical education is and means is what gives rise to these symptoms. Folks may see the symptoms and appreciate them, but they need to understand what is at the root cause of these good things going on in our schools. Therefore, it's imperative. Ministry is hard. It's hard work. It reminds me of the story of a very old man who was on his deathbed, up in his bedroom. Nobody expected him to live through the night. His family had been called in and understand these things. And we take every opportunity to pound this drum in the hearing of our parents, our grandparents, and share that vision regularly with our students, our teachers, and ourselves. We all need a refresher course in the vision. So I think the first thing we need to do as Christian school parents, teachers, educators, board members, is to define worldview. I assume that anyone who spends much time in ACCA will soon hear the term worldview. The idea of a worldview is the most critical concept that a student learns. So two helpful questions need to be asked of our students and ourselves. What constitutes a worldview, and what are the different aspects of a worldview? A worldview is essentially a collection of philosophical belief. It's constituted by a person's presuppositions, as his thoughts in advance. One person who believes a man is naturally evil views a murderer's own nature responsible for that action. Another person who believes that man is essentially good views the murderer as someone who was driven to that act by some outside malign influences. The second person, since his presuppositions don't allow him to find the cause of the murder within the murderer, has to look elsewhere for the root cause. Another example would be the scientist who believes in an ordered universe created and sustained by a knowing, a knowable and reasonable God. This scientist can study his particular field with the understanding that he can discover the laws that govern the cosmos. Another scientist who believes that the universe was created by chaotic events and is maintained by chance has no assurance that if he discovers that 2 + 2 = 4 today, it won't change tomorrow, or that a constant in an equation today won't become a variable tomorrow. And if he insists that he can, he's standing on borrowed ground using a set of presuppositions that believes in constants in the first place. Some presuppositions, like the belief that ideas can and should be proved using logic and reason, a presupposition found in Western thought but not in Eastern thought, are so ingrained in us that we fail to even recognize them as such very often. Integrity is the next important aspect of a worldview. The integrity or consistent worldview affects how evenly one particular worldview is applied and how well it coincides with reality. Some people's worldviews are actually the eclectic blend of several worldviews. The sort of worldview is flawed by its conflicting ideas that have been... Everybody was downstairs making preparations, and as he was lying there in his bed, he smelled this delicious smell. Chocolate chip cookies wafting through the house. And it was his favorite smell from childhood. He cannibalized like parts from a junkyard, or as we go shopping, we take some of this and we leave some of that, and we just kind of fill up our shopping cart. Another worldview's integrity may fail because of an inherent flaw produced within its own, by its own philosophy, like relativism, which fails when we apply its own standards to itself. How can it be a universal philosophy applicable to all people throughout all time when it states that everyone has to choose what's right for himself, and that's true? However, while the integrity of a worldview is important, it's of penultimate importance compared to the last aspect of worldview. The crux of any worldview, any presupposition, is faith. A Christian cannot prove empirically that God exists. An evolutionist, on the other hand, proved that similar genetic structure means common ancestry. Indeed, theories can't be proven, they can only be disproven. A theory not disproven must be taken on faith. Therefore, while a worldview may be disproven through its flaws, for someone to change his worldview is more a matter of the heart than anything else. Our worldview is important. It comes out when we speak, act, or think. Nor is any action, statement, or thought void of one, whether it's a speech, a novel, or a beer commercial. Part of education is learning how to apply a Christian worldview to every aspect of life. As stated in Romans 12, 1-2, learning to discern what is good and acceptable in all of life, including other worldviews. Our school's curriculum and instruction must place Christ right at the center of our worldview. There must be no such thing, I get in trouble sometimes for saying this back at Rockbridge, but it's one of the wonderful freeing things about flying in, dropping my bombs, and flying away. I can say whatever and not be held accountable. There's no such thing as a child-centered classroom at Rockbridge Academy. That pricks people's attention when I first say that. But what I mean by that is that our classrooms must be Christ-centered, not child-centered. As a result, children are systematically taught to take Christ and place him at the center of their worldviews and not themselves. How sad for those children when they grow up one day, for the children who are taught that they're the center of their verse, when they grow up one day and find out that that's really not true. A worldview essentially directs how we live. Perhaps that's why G.K. Chesterton said, "The most important fact about the subject of education is that there is no such thing. Education is not a subject." The most wonderful childhood memories of his mother baking chocolate chip cookies, and as he was smelling the smell of chocolate chip cookies through the house, he began to be revived. And he sat up, and the smell grew stronger as it wafted through the house. It is not deal in subjects. It is instead the transfer of a way of life. Now, Muslims understand that very well. And so they're very careful to educate their children in Muslim schools, inculcating them in a Muslim worldview. Buddhists likewise understand the importance of conveying the Buddhist philosophy to their children, so they educate them accordingly. Why is it that Christians seem to be the only ones who don't get that? That in order for our children to understand, to think, and to take every thought captive to Christ, they must be consciously taught that way. For the Christian, then, Christ is either Lord of our worldview or not at all. There can't be any middle ground. Many people today believe that knowledge is neutral. They think that it really doesn't matter, philosophically speaking, whether their children are educated, whether in a Christian school or a secular school. To them, knowledge is knowledge no matter where it is learned. 2 plus 2 always equals 4, no matter if a child is taught at home, in a Christian school, or a public school. However, because God created the heavens and the earth and all that they contain, it is impossible for knowledge to be neutral. Knowledge comes from somewhere. It doesn't just exist. The source of knowledge is just as important, if not more important, than the knowledge itself. Knowledge that's presented as neutral, therefore, is predicated upon a lie. Such a notion presumes that God, if he exists, is relevant, and that the truth exists apart from him. It might be true that frogs can breathe in water, that the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, but these things are true regardless of who Christ is. But such a worldview necessarily implies that there are no absolutes, no hard and fast moral guidelines by which to live, and hence, no truth. In reality, it's impossible to conceive of truth in a universe where God is anything but all-sovereign creator. Without such a God, there's no fixed reference point from which to evaluate all the other reference points. Truth, and hence knowledge, become relative. The problem is this: man was created by God in God's image. He's given us minds with which to think, but because of our sinful fallen nature, we tend to think in terms that exclude God from our conscious thoughts. As sinful men, our thinking could be compared to a fish in water. What water? A fish takes for granted the water that it swims in until it's removed from it. And he got out of bed and tremulously made his way to the bedroom door and down the hallway and made his way down the stairs and into the kitchen. And there, when he got into the kitchen, he saw trays upon trays of chocolate chip cookies. Likewise, sinful man ignorantly and arrogantly takes for granted his environment, reasoning that it exists apart from God, and since we can't see him. However, like a fish out of water, when man is removed from his environment by death, it's too late to change perspectives. Christians, on the other hand, know that God exists. It ought to be evident to us in all that we see. Therefore, it's inexcusable for Christians to hold to the idea that knowledge is neutral, or that there are some areas of knowledge over which Christ is preeminent, Sunday school, church, family worship, those sorts of things, and other areas of knowledge over which Christ's lordship is debatable, everything else. To be sure, we may reason with people who deny the lordship of Christ over all of life. We must. But reason that assumes reason as its starting point is godless reason. It is the same reason that is applied in secular schools. So we have to ask ourselves, well, where did reason come from? If we say that it just exists, again, our response is no different than that of the secular schools, and we find ourselves arguing that reason developed apart from God. But to think that anything, including reason, exists apart from the sovereign creator is silly. Without God, nothing would exist, including our reason. Therefore, using our God-given reason, we must conclude that God pre-exists even our own reason. It could be no other way and still make sense. John Gatto was awarded New York State. The smell was irresistible. And he reached out his hand to take one of these cookies. And just as he reached for the tray, a spatula came down on the back of his hand, and his wife was standing there with a spatula in her hand, and she said, "Don't touch those, they're for the funeral." Sometimes what it can feel like in Christian work. But Stonewall Jackson's chaplain, R.L. Dabney, once said that Christian education was the most important business on earth. He said that parents ought to believe, they ought to feel called to the fact that it is why they exist. The Christian of their children is why they, as parents, have been brought into existence. Dabney said that all commerce, all war, all human activity ought to be subjugated to that end, educating children for Christ. So I'm here to hopefully share award in both 1990 and 1991. In his revealing book, Dumbing Us Down, I would encourage you to get that, he says this. Now keep in mind, he was Teacher of the Year 2 years in a row in the state of New York. This is what he said. The first lesson I teach is and learning to read and understand what we're reading is hard work, requiring discipline and stick-to-itiveness. Did you also hear the admonition to teach our children diligently? Again, this is hard work and requires diligence on the part of parents, teachers, and students alike. There's no way around it. Mortimer Adler, in his article, Invitation to the Pain of Learning, I love that article, speaking of the modern notion that education must imitate playful fun, had this to say: what cannot be accomplished educationally through elaborate schemes devised to make learning an exciting game must of necessity be foregone. Heaven forbid that learning should ever take on the character of a serious, just as serious as earning money, and perhaps much more laborious and painful. On the other hand, the writer of Ecclesiastes says, I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. There's no escaping it. Learning is hard work, and it ought to be. But it's also a gift from God and requires a thankful response from us. Many Christians make the mistake of thinking that a Christian school is one in which the enrollees, whether that be thought of as students or family members, are all believers. That's what makes it a Christian school. All the enrollees are believers. I don't believe that's so. A Christian school is a school that is established upon the foundation of obedience to the Word of God and the desire to accomplish the principle found in 2 Corinthians 10 that I just mentioned a minute ago, bringing every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. It's a school in which the board, the administration, and the faculty are all gathered around that fundamental principle. You then strive to gather families and students together around you who are in agreement with that, and logically you would expect many of them to be believers. You run certain things up the flagpole and certain people salute. However, if your school is one in which there's confusion or disagreement about the mission of the school between the board or the administration or the faculty or the session of the church, if it's a church-run school, that school will be headed for trouble. If the leadership of a school is not like-minded about the direction in which it's marching, it will likely be marching in circles. If you shoot at nothing, you're likely to hit it every time. Another mistake Christian schools make is thinking of the faith that we teach more illusion. I teach everything out of context. I teach the unrelating of everything. I teach disconnections. I teach too much. The orbiting of planets, the law of large numbers, slavery, adjectives, dance, like ketchup or a condiment that we tack on. We just kind of slather over the good stuff we're learning. As the faculty and administration are committed to a thorough biblical worldview approach to educating their students, Bible verses attached to the top of a math test, or a chapel on Friday, or a prayer over the PA system, none of these things bad in and of themselves, don't get me wrong. But these things become too shallow to fully satisfy. If that's the substance, the sum and substance of what we mean by Christian education, woe to us. We must be committed to thinking Christianly, not only about what we teach, the content, but how we teach, the methodology. Rather than a condiment slathered onto our course of the day, the gospel should be viewed as yeast running inseparably all through. In both Matthew and Luke chapters 13, Jesus tells this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till it was all leavened. In addition, in Matthew 16, he warned his disciples, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. As Matthew Henry said of this passage, the corrupt principles and practices of the Pharisees and Sadducees are compared to leaven. They were souring and swelling and spreading. They fermented wherever they went. Henry makes the same charge about the kingdom of God, though, yet without the malign characteristic. He says the apostles, by their preaching, hid a handful of leaven in the great mass of mankind, and it had a strange effect. It, to ferment, in a sense, turned it upside down and made a wonderful change in the taste and relish of it. The savor of the gospel was manifested in every place. It was effectual not by outward force, but by the Spirit of the Lord of hosts who works. So in order for education to be Christian, the worldview must consciously be biblical in nature. We must confess and then act upon that confession that Christ is Lord of all, not Lord of some. We must teach our students to love God with their whole minds, and that means diligent work. We must understand that a Christian school is not one in which the students are all required to be believers, but rather it's one in which the leadership of the school is consciously pursuing to inculcate this particular mindset into its students. And lastly, a Christian school's gospel of grace permeates everything that goes on within its walls, no matter how simple, mundane, or perfunctory. Well, what does classical mean? St. Augustine began to wrestle with the idea of how the gospel was surprise guests, pull-out programs, standardized tests. What do any of these things have to do with each other? And again, he was Teacher of the Year. As believers, we must come to the point where we teach that the only unifying principle to impact the pagan culture around him, as he was in the midst of the collapse of the Roman Empire. As he saw his culture crumbling around him, he also noticed that young Christians were not being trained to be that peculiar people Christ had called them to be set apart. As he preached in the North African city of Hippo, expounding on Romans 12:1-2, I urge you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as living and holy sacrifices, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. His parishioners came to him and said, Amen. But how? And he didn't have a ready model. There was no pattern for Christian education. There was a pattern of pagan classical education. He knew that the shaping of the mind through the disciplines of grammar, logic, and rhetoric was a good thing, but did it agree with the dictates of the gospel? And so he searched and prayed, and he came to the first and second chapters of the book of Proverbs, and there he found what he thought was a remarkable answer to his question. To know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, of the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. My son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding, yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. It was so poignant, so relevant, yet so simple. To hear those words with new ears was quite a revelation for Augustine. He was a pastor, a wise man, well educated, but when Proverbs 1 and 2, he caught a vision for something new. He began to put together a new academy there in Hippo for a small number of young students that he desired to disciple. He wanted to provide a kind of fortress in which to train these young acolytes. A school or this wonderful world of knowledge is that it coheres in its creator. That alone is the foundation of all knowledge. Now, once we've dispensed with the idea that knowledge can be neutral, we must understand that God requires of first principles. Yes, he wanted to shelter them. The idea that came to Augustine as he read this passage is that the Christian community, the covenantal family, has a responsibility to create a training ground where children may be trained and sequestered for a time. He believed that the church was to create this fortress so that the children may be trained as warriors of truth who would be equipped to take that truth to the lost and crumbling world outside the fortress walls, where they may be taught the first principles of faith in a logical, orderly progression, moving from knowledge to understanding and ultimately to the place of wisdom and discernment. The final years of Augustine's life were devoted to this academy. Eventually, those three categories of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, which he drew from Proverbs, became stages of developmental learning for a new kind of curriculum which really wasn't so new after all. What Augustine was accomplishing was a plundering of the Egyptians of a sort. The pagan Greek culture had developed the educational model of the Trivium, and the Roman culture carried it forward. Augustine was raised in that culture. He was a teacher of rhetoric before he moved to Milan, or to Rome and Milan, where he was eventually converted by the ministry of St. Ambrose. Augustine was not so foolish as to think that anything devised by a pagan culture wasn't worth a second look. So what Augustine did as he searched for a model for Christian was to realize that the biblical pattern of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom coincided with the three stages of the Trivium: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. What Augustine envisioned was a new kind of Christian curriculum that encompassed every discipline and every arena of academic concern. The grammar or knowledge stage was a stage in which the young student would come to get knowledge. The bits and pieces, the data, the raw material of any subject. And the ABCs of language would be the ABCs, phonics, and vocabulary. And the student obviously has to memorize these things. There's no other way around it. There's no trick to memorizing the multiplication tables. No interactive DVD that can enable you to grasp the ABCs of history. You have to memorize the fact that on a brisk October morning in 1066, William of Normandy crossed the English Channel, fought a great battle on the field of Hastings, swept away the Anglo. Teach our children to love him with their whole minds. In 2 Corinthians 10, we read, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing, Saxon monarchy, and ushered in a new age." You have to memorize that stuff. There's no other way around it. So the knowledge or grammar stage is a rote memory stage where the bits and pieces of raw data are poured into the minds of the young people. And oftentimes these are isolated little bits of fragmented data. There's not much holding it all together, and yet the data needs to be there. How many of you knew the ABC song when you entered kindergarten? How many of you knew the A, B, C, D, E, F, G? How many of you knew that when you entered kindergarten? Did you know that it added up to Shakespeare and Milton? You didn't know what to do with it, but if you didn't have that there, you wouldn't have been able to eventually make sense of it. So the data needs to be there. We moderns don't like rote memory, though, do we? Too much like work. My children don't like to memorize poetry or Shakespearean soliloquies or the lines of their upcoming musical. They'll complain that it's boring, and they'll try to put it off for as long as I let them, and then I'll send them away to get to work, and a few minutes later, they have it memorized. Just like that. I'll also have to go back to the book and check and see whether they're right or not. Because I can't memorize a phone number anymore. It's a good thing phone numbers are in sequences of 4 or 3 and 4, because that's how I have to memorize them. I can't do 7. But their minds are like sponges. They just soak this stuff up. I can't memorize the whole prologue to the Constitution of the United States. And then they go and do it, just like that. It's embarrassing. This is the earliest stage of education. The stage needs to be rigorous. If we're not diligent at the knowledge or the grammar, the ABC stage, then every stage that comes after that will be handicapped. Knowing bits and pieces exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. Did you hear all those action verbs in there? It's almost like a little action hero soliloquy. Pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, bringing every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. This is active, athletic, Olympic language. It requires vertebrate education. In Deuteronomy 6, we read, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children." Did you hear the bias towards words there? I guess God could have made knowledge of him communicable through interactive DVDs, entertaining educational television programs on PBS, soft, fuzzy little moppet things. But he didn't do that. He chose to do it through words of poetry, actually sharpen our minds. Because foundationally, we have to have a knowledge base upon which we later build the structures of understanding and wisdom. We have to know things like O world invisible, we view thee. O world intangible, we touch thee. Praise of God, who's the author of them all. It was a day of Leonardo, Magellan, Michelangelo, a day of Luther and Calvin and Erasmus, all at once. You see those bits and pieces are all isolated out there and floating out there. But when we have understanding, we can then begin to weave it all together. And we can see the revolution that's occurring by God's hand in history. But again, this ability to just understand a subject is not enough. It's clear that we're not to stop at knowledge and understanding, but we're to proceed on to wisdom. Wisdom is a remarkable word. Now, I'm no Hebrew grammarian, but I can use a Strong's just as well as the next guy. And wisdom is a word that literally means skillful with the fingers, artful. It's a word that's used of craftsmen. It's a word that describes people who take their understanding and put it to work. They set it to action. They have discernment, and they understand the times, and they know what is to be done. True education isn't truly accomplished until the training is complete, until the Knights Templar have been fully equipped and the students have gone through all three stages. They have the foundation of knowledge, they built upon that knowledge base with understanding, and they crowned that understanding with wisdom. And wisdom is the practical application. It's the skillful craftsmanship that makes Western Christendom more than just a series of achievements. It's what made it a paragon of light and virtue and hope. This system of education is the arch rival, the utter and complete opposite of the educational world that we've grown up to see around, and it's profoundly biblical. So begin with knowledge, proceed to understanding, and cap it all with the great virtue of discernment and wisdom. Let me talk briefly about the 4 biases of a classical education. Classical education places a strong emphasis, as I mentioned, not only on the structural understanding of the native tongue and the literary, poetic, and lyrical fruits of that language, but also learning the grammatical structures and gaining competency in other languages. Latin has always been taught in classical schools, not because it's traditional, and not because it helped the medievals with their SAT tests, but because Latin provides such an incredible insight into English language and opens the doors to learning so many other Romantic languages. Besides, we know from studies done at MIT that a student who knows language will have a greater proficiency in music, and students who understand music will have a greater proficiency in maths and sciences, although that was not the case with me. And so the tradition of classicism has always been to, a world unknowable, we know thee, inapprehensible, we clutch thee. Does the fish soar to find the ocean, the eagle plunge to find the air? That we ask of the stars in motion, do we find rumor of thee there? The heavy emphasis on language. We know from the scriptures that a language is a symbolic embodiment of a people's worldview. All language is a reduction to symbols of certain ideas and notions. And even the sound of language ultimately characterizes a people's worldview. We know that full well. As I mentioned, I lived for 8 years down in Statesboro, Georgia. For those of you who've spent any time up north, you know that English is spoken down here, or even, because I have to be honest with you, in Statesboro they would refer to Atlanta as Yankee Land. So I have to say down there. English as it was spoken down there is quite different from where I grew up in suburban New York City and New Jersey. If I was to be invited to dinner in Statesboro, it might go something like this. Mike, this is Miss Peaches. And we were just wondering if you and your lovely wife and your lovely children would like to come over for a low country boil this Saturday about 4. No need to bring anything. Just bring your lovely wife and children, and we'd love to see you. Okay, we'll see you about then. Bye-bye. I have a friend, Patsy Tomasulo, who was born in the projects in Manhattan. And if he was to invite me over to dinner, it would go something like this. Yo, Mikey, you knucklehead. When are you coming over? Come on over this weekend. We'll barbecue. Bring the wife and kids. Don't tell me no. I don't want to hear no, you pineapple. Okay, we'll see you then. Completely different worldviews, completely different ethos that's being expressed in those 2 invitations. So we need to understand how the degeneration of language ultimately indicates of a culture. The teaching of Ebonics in inner city schools, the writing of rap lyrics using simple letters and numbers to indicate complete words is an indication of the decline of culture, not simply a new direction. So the first great bias of a classical education is language. The second great bias is history. Every discipline must be rooted in an understanding of what comes before. We must comprehend Euclid if we're to truly understand geometry. It's not enough to teach a few theorems and problems and memorize a few rules. Likewise, we need to understand our culture in terms of the sequence of events as God has woven his good providence in space, time, and history. We need to understand these things if we're to have a proper understanding of who we are, and where we're tending. Progressives always assume that change is for the better. Public schools around here may be like the ones up north, where each year some new thing is being tried and the old ones are being jettisoned before we've had a chance to see whether the old ones are ever going to do what they promised those would do. It's just change, not where the wheeling systems darken and our benumbed conceiving soars. The drift of pinions we would hearken beats at our own clay-shuttered doors. The angels keep their ancient places, turn but a stone and start a wing. 'Tis ye, 'tis your change and new, just for the sake of change and new. We see this view all around us in modern academia, where novelty is relentlessly pursued for novelty's sake, and anything conventional is regarded as necessarily outdated. Well, G.K. Chesterton had something to say about this, as he did about many things. He wrote in his book Orthodoxy, "Tradition means giving a vote to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. All Democrats object to men being disqualified by accident of their birth. Tradition objects to their being disqualified by accident of their death. Democracy tells us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is. Tradition asks us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our father." Classical education has a language bias and a history bias. Classical education also has an aesthetic bias. That simply means that every discipline is to be seen in the beauty of God's creation. Every study is to be adorned with the glory of the gospel. Every single discipline is to be seen in the light of God's wonder as he reveals himself in his mercy, truth, and justice, and as he continues to build that mercy, truth, and justice in our lives and in the world around us. Therefore, classical education is to be full of music and art and architecture. I love seeing the pictures around your classrooms upstairs. It's full of nature studies. It's full of the wonder and splendor of God's order. The sciences are not seen as a mere practical approach to getting things done, but rather the sciences are seen as the progressive revelation of the depth and the breadth and the height of God's majesty in the world. In Philippians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul states, "Whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things." Even evangelical Christians, when we deal with aesthetics in our modern culture, typically make the mistake of assuming that God's absolute standards of truth, goodness, and beauty don't apply. Who's to say that your music is better than my music, or her art is better than my art? I had a discussion with a pastor one time who insisted that Bach was not objectively, or that I couldn't prove that Bach was objectively better than the Sex Pistols. We classical Christian educators must begin to rid ourselves of this fallacious, corrupt notion that in matters of aesthetics, relativism rules the day. Strange it faces that miss the many splendored thing. But when so sad thou canst no sadder, cry, and upon thy so sore loss shall shine thy traffic of Jacob's ladder pitched between heaven and Charing Cross. Yea, in the night, my soul, my day, that God is sovereign over all his creation except aesthetics. So classical education has an aesthetic bias, a language bias, an historical bias, and lastly, classical education has an observative bias. Because classical education is necessarily covenantal, it is necessarily an act of discipleship. The task of the master pouring his life into the life of a pupil. The task of the master is simply to enable the child to see, to hear, to taste, to feel, to observe what is actually there. Each year I take my rising seniors on a grand tour to Greece and Italy to see firsthand the fruits of Western that they've been studying. One of my favorite things to do is to take them to this little hole-in-the-wall restaurant in Siena, San Giuseppe's, and get them to taste the milza. Have any of you ever had milza? Okay. For those of you who don't or haven't had milza, It's cow's spleen. Yeah, that's the first thing I thought after I'd already tasted it. But I tasted it first and then found out that it was cow's spleen, and it's wonderfully delicious. And they put on this little toasted spread. Oh, it's the greatest thing. But I love to see my students' faces light up when they eat this cow's spleen, this milze, because it's not something they would normally encounter, you know, at McDonald's or down the street or in mom's kitchen. And I just love to see their worlds open up, their mind expanded to something new. And who knows what they'll try after eating cow's spleen, but they might. So how many students today can't make heads or tails of a pie chart? Or how many students today can't read a simple bank statement? How many students today can't discern the difference between Georgian and Baroque architecture? How many students today wouldn't be able to tell you the difference between the passionate romanticism of Rachmaninoff and the classical balance and symmetry of Mozart? How many children couldn't tell you the difference between a Baltimore Oriole or a Cardinal? What a tragedy. The reason they can't is because they've never been taught to see, or hear, or taste, or touch. They've never been taught to observe and distinguish, and that's the master's job. Classical education is observative. It teaches a student how to organize, how to categorize, how to classify, but first of all, how to see. So a language bias, a history bias, an aesthetic bias, an observative bias, these are the heart and soul of what we teach. These are the cry clinging heaven by the hems, and lo, Christ walking on the water, not of Gennesaret, but Thames. These are the building blocks, the knowledge. And our culture is all the worse if we lack them. But if we do things in life, these are the kinds of things that enable us to appreciate life. They give us breadth and depth. This isn't the egghead ivory tower, distant and impractical stuff of modern academia. This is the stuff of life. It's as practical as a perennial garden, as glorious as a pursuit as playing catch with my son James in the backyard. Terribly useless stuff in the modern view of ultimacy and pragmatism. Well, finally, there are some lies we have to unlearn. There's a great deal. In order to make this kind of education successful, we have to divorce ourselves from many false notions we might have. I think one of the first things we need to do is define and distinguish multicultural education from multiculturalism. The former, multicultural education, consists of educating about other cultures, examining their culture and practices empirically, and, as we're talking about Christian education, biblically. To this, no educator I know has any objection. We should learn about other cultures, other peoples, other places, other times. We cannot be so provincial as to say that we're not going to learn about anybody else but just us. But this is not what multiculturalists want. Multiculturalism is an ideology holding that all cultures, values, practices are equal. It is essentially egalitarianism. It doesn't maintain this view consistently, however. The exception, the culture defined as European, male, heterosexual, Christian, which multiculturalists typically deride as oppressive and intolerant. And dividing the world into victims and oppressors makes multicultural. We don't want to stop at knowledge. We've seen in our modern academic circles that there are plenty of people with incredible amounts of knowledge. They just don't know what to do with it. They memorize all kinds of facts and figures. Near where I live in suburban Washington, D.C., policy wonks abound all around us. They can fix a hard drive in no time at all, but they can't talk to their teenager. And so upon the foundation of knowledge must be placed a structure of understanding. This understanding stage is a logical stage. It's a stage that takes the bits and pieces of raw data and makes connections. It weaves a fabric of understanding so that vocabulary words are now woven into sentences and paragraphs, so that mathematical abstractions suddenly become a way to count your so that the events of the Reformation and Renaissance and the Jihad of Suleiman, which all happened within a 20-year span of Martin Luther's 95 Theses to the writings of Calvin's Institutes, are seen as a confluence of remarkable events in 1,000 different spheres that all come together to the essentially Marxist in its origins and basic assumptions. But what follows is a reductio ad absurdum. For example, if all cultures are equal, then one must accept as equal to our own those cultures built around extreme xenophobia, cannibalism, or human sacrifice. Too. Like-mindedness among Christians, according to Christ, is a gift from God for which we must earnestly pray. God is the Father of spirits and fashions the hearts of men alike. Opens our understanding, softens the hearts, sweetens the affections, and gives grace and the Spirit to those that ask him. We're taught to pray that the will of God be done on earth as it is in heaven. Gee, talk about lockstep uniformitarianism. And our command is to pray that it be done on earth that way. On the contrary, nowhere in Scripture are we commanded to find people who disagree with us, who have a different set of goals and objectives, completely different worldview, and who see a different end in sight, and then work alongside them trying to find or accomplish something productive. It's almost absurd we think we could. It used to be that the most popular verse in the Bible was John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Do you know what the most popular verse in the Bible is now? Judge not, lest ye be judged. We are relentlessly bludgeoned in our modern culture with two sides of the same coin. Don't judge anything and appreciate everything. This idea flies in the face of reason and Scripture. Unmasked, it's an admonition to stop thinking. As Christians, we're called not only to think, but to think antithetically about the world in which we live. We can't possibly love the right things without the wrong things. Jesus said in John 7:24, do not judge according to outward appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. So not only are we not commanded to avoid making judgments, we're commanded to make righteous judgments. The only question then is, on what basis will we make those judgments? And I submit to you that it's the foundation of Scripture alone. In 1 Timothy 6, we read, these things teach and exhort. If any man teach otherwise, and consent not to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine which is according to godliness, from such withdraw yourself. Someone explained to me how we obey the words of Paul to Timothy while appreciating and not making any judgments about anything, just appreciating everybody and everything. On the other hand, I urge our students to make judgments based on Scripture, right reason, and good and necessary inference. All of these require us at some point to say, I appreciate that, but I don't appreciate that, and here's why. What we want, in short, general multicultural education solidly refutes multiculturalism. Its call for an egalitarianism of cultures and lifestyles makes an intellectually dishonest attack on Western culture that's divisive and destructive. Thus, the necessity of back to our students is a sense of taste and discernment. It goes hand in hand with the observative bias I spoke about earlier. As our students are taught to really see, hear, observe, they are able to make distinctions about what is good, true, noble, lovely, and appreciate those things without having to appreciate all the things which are not. However, lest you misunderstand what I'm saying, we want our students to be flavored with Christian humility and grace as they make these judgments. We want them to think antithetically, but that doesn't mean being an obnoxious bore. Several years ago, just to wrap up here, several years ago we took our middle school singing group, RAS, Rockbridge Academy Singers, to a choral festival at a public middle school town near where we live. And in the band room, about this size, there was a banner stretched across the back wall. And the banner read thusly, the music you enjoy listening to, no matter how bad, is really good music. Let me just repeat that. The music you enjoy listening to, no matter how bad, is really good music. As we parents and teachers stood there contemplating what we were reading, we were struck by the fact that the only way you could read that and not be struck by the sheer absurdity of it was as if you had been taught to judge nothing, appreciate everything, make no distinctions, reach no conclusions, and live in a bland grayness where all that you gazed upon was an endless parade of the same thing. What a bleak and paralyzing world that would be to live in. As classical and Christian school educators and parents, we have to begin with a biblical world and life view, become students of the classical model, reject the modern notions all around us, and the idea that all things, no matter how repugnant or revolting, must be appreciated without question. Thank you for your time and attention. Appreciate it. exposing it to its incursions into the arena of education. To protect itself, multiculturalism relies on a level of newspeak that would have impressed George Orwell. Diversity is promoted to advance multiculturalism, but it doesn't extend to ideas. The modern college campus is an example of how diversity of ideas is not solicited. Tolerance is advanced as the highest ethic to which we should aspire, but multiculturalists are resolutely intolerant of Western traditions. Sensitivity is promoted, but multiculturalists are anything but sensitive to the practicing Christians who are being enslaved and murdered in Sudan and elsewhere. The world tells us that we must worship at the altar of diversity. Thinking has invaded even Christian culture. I think this way of thinking is unbiblical for two reasons. First, if we think about diversity in purely racial terms, as in we wonder how many Latinos are on the president's cabinet, or what percentage of Asians attend this college, or that kind of thing, I think we're practicing racist. We're looking at people by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. I can't find any way around that conclusion. The talking heads and politicians that we see around us who make race the primary motivating factor behind everything they do and say, and then try to explain to us how they're not playing the race card, live in a fantasy land. Secondly, if we think about diversity not strictly in terms of race, but in terms of ideas and vision and goals, then I think we're just... The Bible commands us to pursue like-mindedness. Now the God of patience and consolation grant you to be like-minded toward one another according to Jesus Christ, Romans 15. Fulfill my joy that you might be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind.